Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and owner of 3 ponies. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing 3 easy keepers on multiple acres of Iowa pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and we've been collaborating on this podcast for the past year. And like most good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We're always talking about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
Thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy the following episode.
For the last 5 days, Jill has been texting me pictures of hay on the ground, hay in windrows, hay being baled, hay in wagons, and hay being stacked just about everywhere, I think. I think there's hay in her, wouldn't be surprised, there's hay in her kitchen. Anyway, it appears that Jill is officially a hay farmer.
Yes, I love and hate haying all at once. This was our first year this was our first cutting, not even our first year, our first cutting that we have taken this on all by ourselves. In previous years, we bought this property 2 years ago, and in previous years, we have had another farmer come in and do everything for us, and all we've had to do is stack the hay. And so this was our first time doing it all ourselves.
Let's be clear. I mean, only stacking hay, that's a lot of hard work, but I think the stress level is a lot higher when you have to do everything yourself. So, this whole hay saga started off with you reseeding a hay field because it had a lot of alfalfa in it, and you didn't want the alfalfa for your ponies because they're such easy keepers. And as you mentioned, your local kind of co-op would come in and do all the work. But now you seem to own a lot of hay-related equipment and be doing it yourself.
Yes. And it is so stressful. Everybody should thank their hay farmer every time they see them, because I didn't realize the stress level that was involved with hay. When we bought the property, we have about 8 acres. It was primarily alfalfa. And so I had the entire property sprayed and killed all of the alfalfa, which every local farmer here thought I was completely crazy. Apparently, it's hard to get a good stand of alfalfa. I don't know, because my ponies don't eat alfalfa. So I killed it all. And then had a custom seed mix made for my ponies. So I ended up with Timothy, Brome, and Orchard. And I had the local extension office come out. We walked the property. We tested the soil. We had the local co-op come out. They looked at everything, decided what weeds needed to be sprayed, what type of spray needed to go on everything. And then I had a local farmer come and seed it for me. And so the first year, it was not very good, which I guess is normal for when you start a new hay field. And the second year, we had a drought. So this is the first year I've actually really had hay that we've been able to bale and be, I guess, happy or proud of.
Yeah, that's great. I remember last year, as you mentioned, you didn't have any hay. There was a drought in your area. And I remember you being very disappointed that you'd put in all this effort and seeded this hay field. And it was pretty wimpy. I remember you sending me pictures then. And, but now it seems you have hay stored everywhere. There's hay in your husband's garage. There's hay. You've got stacks of hay all over the place.
I think that last year we ended up with, it was less than 400 bales. And 400 bales in Iowa, when you're relying on somebody else to bale for you, they bale them between 40 and 60 pounds. They're so light. When we were in Colorado, we had 75 to 85 pound Timothy bales. So they were very light. There wasn't very many of them. And yes, we had no rain. And it was really, really disappointing. And then this year, it just would not stop raining this spring. We went to the exact opposite end. And I had hay growing like crazy. And we couldn't cut it because it was too wet. And it would not stop. We couldn't get a window to actually cut and get it on the ground and get it baled.
Right. Yeah, that's stressful. It's like my grandfather was a dairy farmer and I grew up helping make hay and stuff. And it's super stressful. You need multiple dry days in a row, which living on the West Coast as I have the last 20 plus years, we don't struggle with that so much. We're really lucky we can make really nice hay out here because we have multiple days of it. We control the rain flow because we're irrigating, right? And so we don't have that problem. And so we don't have to battle the rain quite as much. Here in Arizona, we do in the summer with the monsoon rain, we can certainly get caught out. But it's tricky. And again, I don't know that people really appreciate the stress of that. So now you have this purpose-seeded field with several varieties of grass hay in it. And you cut that and bale that. And then you have this waterway hay, which was news to me. I never even heard of such a thing.
So yes, waterway hay. I think it's in Iowa and Nebraska mainly. The total property is 40 acres. We have 21 acres of actual crop. So this year we have beans. But in between the bean crop, there is what is called waterway hay. It is an orchard mix hay. And what happens in that waterway is the water actually is draining out of the crop field into that. And so it's to help with erosion and to take all that water on. So it can be very nice if you stay on top of the weeds. It also, because it has so much water moving through it, can pick up a lot of weeds from other fields. So you do need to manage that waterway if you are going to bale it. A lot of people just round bale it and give it to their cows. I had mine sprayed last year for weeds, and actually I really like my waterway hay. It is a softer orchard grass. It's not very stemmy. It doesn't get very tall. It's just a lighter. So I mix the two, my planted field and my waterway. I mix those together during the winter for my ponies.
Very cool. So how many bales did you put up this year? You did 2 cuttings, right?
We did 2 cuttings. And our first cutting, and we didn't even get it all cut on the first cutting. I ended up having the local farmer come and round bale it, take it to his cows. So my cutting, we got 460 on the first, and we got, I think, 280 this time. So I am full. When you said I have hay everywhere, I have hay in my barn. I have hay in the covered breezeway outside of my barn. And then I also have a machine shed and I have bales of hay in there. But I'm close to 800 bales of hay, and I only need about 400 bales to feed my 3 ponies for the year.
Right. Well, I'm sure there was plenty of hay in your house by the time you were done with it as well. But anyway, so we thought we would talk about hay today, obviously, since it's that time of year. Folks are buying hay, people are putting up their final cuttings for the year, and people are thinking about what they're going to do for hay this winter. And I know, a lot of people maybe don't have the ability to store a lot of hay and buy a whole winter's worth of hay. And maybe they're buying it, bale at a time for their feed store, what have you. But I still think there's some interesting information here that will be helpful to those folks. And hopefully, obviously, what we're going to talk about today will be helpful to anybody who's thinking of buying hay in kind of larger amounts. But we're going to talk all about different kinds of hay and just a few things to know about.
Well, there is certainly a lot of talk online in various groups about the different types of hay, needing certain types of hay for certain horses, some of which, in fact, is a myth. So we're going to try and sort some of that out.
So many myths about hay.
There's so many myths about hay. So let's start in the broadest sense of defining different types of hay. Can you explain to us what is the difference between alfalfa and grass hay?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. So alfalfa is part of a class of plants that we call legumes, right? So people are probably familiar with legumes, having them in their kitchen, like peas and beans are legumes, right? And so what makes legumes special is that they have this symbiotic nitrogen-fixing bacteria that live on nodules on the roots. It's kind of magic, right? And so if you ever pull up a legume and you look at the roots, they have these little bumps on them, and those are the nodules. The roots are not completely smooth. They have little balls on them, and those are these nitrogen fixing nodules. And so these plants are able to fix nitrogen out of the air and use that to make protein. And so legumes generally have a higher protein content than grass hay. So your alfalfa, which is the most common legume we feed horses, is going to have a higher crude protein content than your grass hays are going to.
So are there different types of legume hays for horses? I know you said alfalfa. Are there other options?
Yeah, there are. So alfalfa is the one I think we most commonly think about when we think about legumes, but clover is a legume and that'll find its way into hay. Sometimes, especially if you've got a clover grass field, you'll get a mix there. Vetch is a legume. Peanut hay, which is becoming more common in certain areas in the US, that's also a legume hay.
Is there anything else that makes them different from grass hays?
Yeah, they also tend to be higher in calcium. And the big one I think about a lot is that pound for pound, your legumes are going to be higher in calorie than your grass hays. That's another big difference.
Does that make them a good choice for horses that are harder keepers then?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to me, there's a bit of a sweet spot. For the harder keepers, certainly you're going to get more calories from a pound of alfalfa hay than you will from most grass hays. The protein quality is a little better, meaning that the amino acid profile is a little better than most grass hay, so it might help those horses maintain muscle mass a little more. I certainly know some dressage trainers who feel that if their horses don't get any alfalfa, they don't maintain their top lines as well. And there's probably something to that. It's probably that the amino acid profile is improved by having a little bit of alfalfa. That higher calcium content can also help buffer stomach acid. So again, if your hard keeper is, a stressy type of hard keeper and you maybe need some help with managing stomach acid, an ulcer risk, then having some alfalfa can be useful too. So I do think that, in the diet of hard keepers, alfalfa can be kind of a good choice.
And again, I sprayed all my property to get rid of the alfalfa. The high calorie content makes it a challenge for my ponies. And so that's the reason why I chose to eliminate it from my mix.
Yeah, I don't generally recommend alfalfa for the easy keepers very often because I really like to keep as much forage in front of horses as possible. And if you're feeding a lot of alfalfa to easy keepers, let's say that easy keeper has a daily calorie requirement of 20 megacalories per day, you're going to get there with less pounds of forage than you will if you use a grass hay. And I want to be able to put as much hay in front of horses as possible for their gut health and mental well-being. So if you do that with straight alfalfa, you're going to really be limiting the total amount of hay that you feed to keep that horse in good condition and not get overly fat. And even when I have the harder keepers, some of these alfalfas are 20, 22% crude protein. They just don't need that much protein. And certainly out west, our calcium content can be really quite high. Like our alfalfas here out in the west, it's not uncommon for them to have a 6-to-1 calcium phosphorus ratio, when really an ideal calcium phosphorus ratio is more in that 1.5 to 2 times more calcium than phosphorus. And I find it hard to bring that ratio down in a diet that has a lot of alfalfa in it. So my sweet spot, if I'm going to feed alfalfa, is to feed about 25 to 30% of the total forage intake as alfalfa and the rest of it from something else like a grass hay, or even, we have some grain hays out on the West Coast and that can be a nice combination as well. But with the easy ponies, I just stick pretty much exclusive to grass hay.
So let's talk about that. What is grass hay?
Yeah, it's really a collective name, right? So it's just sort of a collective name for any hay that's not a legume. I think we just kind of use that term collectively. So it could be Timothy, orchard, broom, technically Bermuda, teff, they're all grass hays. So I think it's interesting because people don't often talk about Bermuda or teff as grass hay. They call them Bermuda, they call them teff. I think in general that, if a hay comes off of a field, like if you have a field that's like straight Bermuda, then you're going to call that probably Bermuda. Or if you feed your horse straight Timothy, it came off a straight Timothy field, then you're going to say you feed Timothy. But I think sometimes grass hay is just sort of a catch-all term. Certainly there are, like your hay field, right, where you've got a blend of 3 different types of grass, then you're going to, you're not going to call that orchard, broom, or whatever, Timothy mix. You're just going to call it grass hay. So it's sort of a collective term, but, all of those grasses are technically grass hays. I mean, people are always surprised when I say, Bermuda's a grass hay. They're like, that's a grass hay? I'm like, yeah, it's a grass hay. So in reality, they're all examples of grass hay.
Are they all the same nutritionally?
Yes and no. How's that for an answer? So the cool season grasses are going to be similar. And then the warm season grasses will be similar to each other, kind of like Bermuda's a warm season grass. But between the two, cool and warm season grasses tend to be slightly different from each other in some interesting ways.
Hang on. Cool season and warm season? What are we talking about?
So I know, right? So grass species get categorized as either being a cool or a warm season type of grass based on when they do the majority of their growing, right? So Cool season grasses, so that's your timothy, your brome, your fescue, your orchard, what you're growing in your field. Those are all cool season grasses. And you've probably noticed that they actually start growing in the late winter. The leaf starts growing in the late winter or early spring. And then they're putting out their flowers and going to seed in the spring and early summer. And then they go fairly dormant over the summer. And you have these same grasses in your pastures that your ponies are in. And, you notice that there's a lot of growth in the early summer. And then you sort of get to August and the growth kind of slows down a bit. And so these cool season grasses don't grow at the same rate all through the summer, right? They slow down as the weather warms up and gets hotter. In contrast, the warm season grasses like the Bermuda, like teff, they don't really put up new leaf until late spring, early summer. And they grow new leaves and they're slower to set seed. And they don't really go to seed until the early fall. And then they go dormant through the winter. So here in Arizona, we grow Bermuda in our lawns in the summer because it's very heat tolerant and it doesn't require as much water to grow. But it pretty much is dormant come the end of October. And so then we overseed our lawns with rye. And rye is a cold season grass. And rye is amazing all winter and it's beautifully green. But then you get to like May and it gets up over 100 degrees here and then it dies and the Bermuda starts coming out. So that's these are the differences between cool and warm season grasses. And then it's interesting because they fix carbon differently. It's not, the reason why they handle these different climates, have these sort of specialties in the climates that they handle, is actually in how they fix carbon. And so they both photosynthesize, right? They're both using photosynthesis to generate carbohydrate. But cool season grasses undergo what's called C3 photosynthesis. And warm season grasses undergo C4 photosynthesis. And we're not going to get into the details of that. But they differ in the type of carbohydrate that they create and how it's stored. And that's the most important thing. So cool season grasses are better able to withstand frost and low light and low temperatures. And warm season grasses, they do better in hotter weather and they require less water.
And how do they differ nutritionally?
Yeah, so that kind of comes down to that difference in how they photosynthesize, right? So I don't see a lot of difference between the cool season varieties based on variety alone. So people always say that to me. They sort of say, is timothy lower in sugar than orchard, or should I buy broom? And I'm always like, well, actually, I'm much more interested in how mature they were when they were cut and how they were grown and the conditions under which they were cut. That's a much bigger impact in my mind than whether it's timothy or orchard, right? But there are differences in the carbohydrate composition between cool and warm season. So, for example, our friends at Equine, the analysis lab that will happily analyze your hay samples for you and your pasture for that matter, they actually lump grass hays together. And when you look at the analysis they have for all of the grass hays they've analyzed over many years, there's an average in something called water-soluble carbohydrate, which is an example of a kind of sugar. On average, they have a WSC of just over 11% and a range of about 6.5% to about 16% sugar, and a starch content of about 1.3% and a range of 0.1% to about 2.5%. When you compare that to Bermuda being a warm season grass, they actually have broken that out separately. So they do have analyses values separately for Bermuda. That has an average sugar of about 7%. So that cold season, all those cold season grasses, they had a WSC sugar average of about 11.3%. Bermuda is about 7%. And Bermuda ranges from about 4.5% to 9% on that sugar, whereas those cold season grasses were about 6.5% to 16%. So you start to notice that the cold season grasses, on average, are higher in water-soluble carbohydrate sugar than Bermuda is. But then we get to starch, and the Bermuda has an average of 3.5% starch content with a range of 0.7 to 6.5. And when we compare that to the starch in the cold season grasses, they were averaging about 1.3%. Remember, Bermuda is about 3.6. And the cold seasons are ranging from like 0.1 to 2.5. And the Bermuda is ranging from 0.7 to 6.5. So you start to see the Bermuda, the warm season grasses, they're actually storing their carbohydrate as starch. And so it's sort of an interesting difference. And why that's important is that where starch gets stored in the plant, it gets stored in something called a vacuole, and that has a finite amount of space. So your warm season grasses are actually limited on how much starch they can actually store based on just available space. Whereas the cold season grasses, they're storing their carbohydrate differently and they don't have the same space constraints. And so they can just keep generating more and more sugar and they don't have that space limitation, storage limitation, the way that the warm season grasses do. So generally, the warm season grasses are considered to be lower in non-structural carbohydrate than our cold season grasses are. And so that matters if you're feeding ponies and horses that have issues with metabolic problems like insulin dysregulation, equine metabolic syndrome, and some horses that have polysaccharide storage myopathy as well. That can be an issue for some of those type 1 PSSM horses as well. So that's kind of where it matters. Other than that, they're pretty similar. Like Bermuda has an average protein of 11.5%, those grass hays, 11%. Calorie-wise, Bermuda has an average calorie of 0.9 megacalories. All those grass hays had an average of 0.9 megacalories. So on that front, they're very similar. But it is how they store their carbohydrate that differs. And for some horses, that matters.
Let's go back to what you said about maturity at cutting. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so that can really be important. You know, people get very caught up in, should I buy first cutting or second cutting hay? And honestly, I'm more interested in how mature was that grass when it got cut. So if we think about how plants grow, cut your lawn, for example, and it's really short. And then you notice that there's a leaf that starts growing. And for a little while, it's all leaf and not a lot of stem. And then the stem starts growing and the leaf stays about the same size, but the stem gets longer and longer and longer. So proportionally, there becomes less and less leaf relative to the amount of stem because the stem is growing and the relative amount of leaf is getting less the more mature that plant is. And the stem component of your grass is less digestible than the leaf. So the more mature that plant is when it's cut, doesn't matter whether we're talking grass hays, warm season, cold season, alfalfa is the same across the board. The older, the longer it's been growing before it gets cut, the stemmier it's going to be, the lower its nutritional value is going to be. So I'm more interested in the maturity of that plant when it was cut than I am was it a first or second cutting? Now, having said that, generally, first cuttings, it can be harder to get in the field on time. So sometimes there will be benefits to first or second cutting hay.
I'm just going to add in here because I have the Easy Keeper ponies, which one is borderline IR. I let my hay go to seed. I want to be able to feed as much hay as I possibly can all winter, so I always have hay in front of my ponies, and I don't want it to have great nutritional value. That is obviously a lot different than somebody that's got a barn full of thoroughbreds that are hard keepers. They're going to want to look for a better quality hay than what I'm feeding, this very stemmy, very mature hay, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I would really not want to feed your hay to my thoroughbred. I would have to feed him so much of it. And honestly, he wouldn't probably be very interested. He probably would not be very motivated to eat it, right? So absolutely, different kinds of hays for different horses with different issues.
Right. So I think that's really important when people are out shopping this fall or right now, if they're looking at hay, to keep in mind, what does your horse need? That's going to help direct you to what type of hay is going to be best when you're actually looking at the bales. And you said, like, we talked about the first and the second. When you're looking at hay for sale, it's like second cutting, third cutting.
Right.
Is there one that's better? I mean, I cut first and second hay, and they both have good qualities to them for myself. But people seem to have this in their mind that they can't buy the first cutting hay. So what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, again, I think it really comes down to the point you raised of what kind of horse are you feeding? So as I mentioned, it's often hard to get in the field on time with a first cutting hay, right? As you found out, the weather has to cooperate. You're cutting that a little bit earlier in the spring or summer, and maybe the weather's not quite settled yet. You've got fewer drier days, that kind of thing. And so like you found it was raining, you couldn't get in there and cut it when you wanted to. So, I mean, you were going for mature hay. You ended up with super mature hay because you got stuck, an extra week or whatever that you couldn't get in there. And so now that hay's even stemmier. There's pros and cons to that, right? So in your situation where you have easy keeper horses, not that big of a deal because you're going to have a lower nutritional value hay. So that's a good thing. You also have more yield. I mean, you mentioned, what did you say? You got something like 400 and something bales off your first cutting?
Correct.
And 200 and something off your second cutting. Now, that's very standard. And so that actually has an impact on the price. People, if you're buying by the bale, this will impact your price because that hay has been in that field longer. It's been in there since it started growing in the early spring. And there's more mass per acre. There's more yield per acre. There's more bales per acre. Those bales tend to be cheaper. Whereas second cutting, you tend to have a little less yield per acre. You're going to be paying a little more premium for second cutting, but it may have slightly better nutritional value, as you mentioned. And so again, like I might be looking for second cutting hay for my thoroughbred. That first cutting hay for your ponies is perfect. So I really and again, at the end of the day, it really comes down to how mature was that plant, because you could have a fabulous first cutting where you got in there just perfect and it's great. And then the second cutting, it rained and you don't get in there. So, but those are some sort of rules of thumb around first and second cuttings that I think are fairly safe takeaways.
Well, like you mentioned, my first cutting this year was wet. We had a very small window to get the hay down. We were already past maturity on the hay. We cut it and we were tedding it 3 times a day for 4 days and didn't have a choice but to bale it because it was going to rain. So it did get baled wet, and people say that's cow hay. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts around putting up hay that is potentially too wet?
Yeah, it's not ideal, right? Because the reason it's not ideal is if it's wet, it actually starts to ferment and generate heat. And there's a risk associated with that. I mean, I think we've all been unfortunate enough to see pictures in the papers or pictures online of, hay barns that have self-combusted. And the reason that happens is often because hay is put up too wet with not enough space around it for airflow. And it continues, it's still alive, right? Those plants are still respiring and there's bacteria on them and they're fermenting, and that process generates heat and they can actually self-combust. So you have to be a little bit careful if you put up hay that's a little too wet. And if they don't self-combust, they generate heat, and then you can end up with mold, and you can also end up with browned hay where it got too hot and it actually damaged itself from the heat that was generated. So it isn't ideal. I mean, ideally, we try to put up hay with a moisture content of less than 15% is ideal. Larger bales generally need to be drier because they're obviously larger. And if you think about, out here, we've got bales that are 100, 110 pounds, or sometimes these massive bales, right? Almost 900-pound bales, those big round bales. The center of a round bale, if it's wet when it's baled, is never going to dry, right? So big bales need to be put up drier, generally about 3 to 5% drier than smaller bales. Little bales like you're talking about, those like 40-pound bales that you guys are putting up in your area, they could be put up a little more moist, like 18 to 20% moisture. But any wetter, they really need to be treated with a desiccant. And a desiccant is a substance that's going to pull the moisture out of the hay and then kind of protect it and stop it from going moldy. So sometimes we also put preservatives on hay. Propionic acid is one that people might be aware of. And that is an acid that actually is generated in the horse's hindgut as a result of microbial fermentation. It is a natural acid. It's not, don't think horrendous things about this acid. It is a preservative, and it gets sprayed on the hay as it enters the baler. And so it's throughout the hay, and then it gets baled with this preservative on it. So the other thing too is if your hay gets wet when it's down in the field, and obviously you have this situation where you just had to bale it as it was, but the water-soluble carbohydrates I was talking about earlier are water-soluble. And so actually if you cut your hay and it gets rained on, there has the potential to actually leach some of that water-soluble sugar out of the hay. And as long as it's then allowed to dry properly, that hay will be perfectly fine to feed to horses. And actually, if you've got metabolic horses, it can be great because it's going to be even lower sugar, because a lot of the sugar that was in there could have been washed out. Think about people soak their hay, right, for their metabolic horses to leach the sugar out of it. So hay that's lying in a field that gets rained on may be lower in sugar than it would otherwise be. And as long as it's been allowed to dry properly and then put up appropriately, it'll be safe to feed. So it really comes down to handling how wet was it and how has it been handled subsequently and how has it been stored subsequently. That's going to determine whether or not it's cow hay or not.
I ended up salting mine, not all of it. What I did was the bales that were really wet, I set them aside, and I walked around my bale with a hygrometer and checked the moisture level and the temperature of the bales, and anything that I was worried about, I pulled them out of the stack. But
hang on, now you're using big words. You used a what?
Hygrometer.
What's one of those for those that don't know?
So it's the same as the temperature gauge, but it's checking the moisture content in the bale. So it looks like a probe. You stick it in there and it's going to tell you what the percentage is. You said you want it to be under 15%, whereas some of these were substantially higher than that. So I went to my local feed store. I got a 50-pound bag of salt. I set these bales that were really wet to see if I could salvage them on their sides on pallets. They were not stacked. And I put salt on them, and I turned them about 4 times a day, salting them, and I kept them separate and unstacked. And to see if they were going to dry out.
Did they?
Yeah, I probably could have fed a half of the bale. The inside never got dry enough.
Yeah.
Not for me anyway. So I gave them to a cattle farmer down the road, and he took them, and the cows can eat them, and that's fine. I guess that's the home option if you're not going to be spraying it or have any fancy. I don't have the fancy equipment yet. So
Yet. You've learned not to say never. You said you were never going to get a baler, and now you own one of those.
Correct. So you mentioned different sizes of bales. What are the pros and cons to having small bales or having a round bale? I know a lot of people here get round bales and they put them in the pasture for their horses. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's less labor, right, to be able to put out a big round bale and maybe
especially at negative 30.
Right? Just stab the thing with your tractor and drive it out there and drop it in the hoop and off you go kind of thing. Yeah, there's pros and cons, right? The biggest pro is reduced labor, as you said, when it's minus whatever, wherever you live. The downside is there's a big mold risk, right? So if your horses don't get through it quick enough and it's sitting out there and you don't have it covered adequately, it can start to mold. And there have been cases of botulism of horses eating round bales. So I think if you're going to do round bales in a pasture situation, it's really worth talking to your vet about whether or not you're a good candidate for vaccination against botulism. Other issues with round bales are, I think we've all seen the meme that floats around every now and again of the tiny pony with only its butt sticking out the round bale. You know, if they stick their heads in those round bales, there's not a lot of airflow and airway health can be compromised by that. So those are always my big concerns: mold, airway health, botulism. There's also research showing a huge amount of wastage off of round bales if they're not put in some kind of feeder that helps reduce wastage. And I think we've all seen those photographs of horses where they're standing on half the bale. You know, it's just kind of come off the bale and they trampled it into the mud. And it's obviously can be hard to move the bales around, to move them to different areas. And so they often end up being very muddy. So I think if you're going to feed round bales, think about, can you build some kind of raised platform that the horses have to step up onto, maybe that's got gravel and things in it where, they're up out of the mud, eating off those round bales, have a cover over the round bale so it's not exposed to the elements, and make sure your horses can get through it quick enough that it's not going to mold and put them at risk that way.
Yes. And not only are they standing in it, you see lots of horses here in the winter when it is negative 30 and they're just laying on it because it makes a really nice bed once it's all spread out.
Right?
So there's that. Are there any types of hay people shouldn't be feeding to horses?
I am not a big fan of the sorghum hays, right? So these sometimes they go Johnson grass, Sudan hay, and there's a risk of high nitrate levels, and horses are not as sensitive to nitrates as cows are, but that it can be a concern. They also release something called prussic acid after they've been stressed. So especially if they've been hit with a freeze. And so this can actually lead to ingestion of plants containing quite high levels of hydrogen cyanide. And so you could potentially see cyanide poisoning. And since we don't always know the conditions under which our hay is grown when we're buying them from growers, I just avoid it, to be honest. It's not something I would recommend. Similarly, I'm always very cautious about feeding fescue hays to brood mares because fescues can be contaminated with something called endophyte, which is a fungus on the grass, which then releases alkaloid toxins. And this is a toxin produced by the endophyte fungus. And it can actually lead to brood mares having multiple problems with reproduction. There are endophyte-free types of fescue. Again, you need to know your grower really well and really trust them that they really have grown an endophyte-free version of fescue. I don't know that I'm that trustworthy. If I had a broodmare I was breeding and had a lot on the line, I think I would just avoid fescue, period. I just don't do fescue with broodmares. So there are endophyte-free versions of fescue out there. How do you know for sure that's what you're getting when you're getting fescue? I don't know. Right? So that's a lot of trust there. So I just avoid fescues when we're talking broodmares.
Well, that's all the time we have. Hay, having the right kind of hay, it can all be really stressful. And anyone who stores enough hay for the winter knows the relief of having a full hay barn. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, it's a big topic, right? And it's a lot of money. Let's be honest. There's a lot of money tied up in our hay. So don't skimp on your hay, right? It will pay you back in spades. Investing in your hay is a really sound investment in your horse's health. If you're lucky enough to buy it off the field or direct from a grower, get to know your hay grower. Have them be your friend. As Jill's found out, they're working really hard to grow hay for you. So you can go see the fields. I know a lot of growers that will let you go see the field so you know where your hay is coming from. You can see, does it have weed in it and that kind of a thing. Can you get a broken bale to try feeding to make sure your horses will eat it before you commit to buying it? And I think a really big takeaway is that, without testing your hay, you really don't know what's in it. And people can get really caught up in should I feed Timothy? Should I feed Broom? Or thinking that, it's been pretty fashionable recently, or I'll just feed teff to my metabolic horses because teff is low in sugar. Well, is it? Because I've definitely seen tests of teff that had more sugar in than an orchard, for example, and vice versa. So I've seen teff with more than 12% sugar in it. I've seen orchard with less than 12% sugar in it. So just because it's teff doesn't mean to say that it's going to be low in sugar. So again, if you're feeding carb-sensitive horses, you really do need to be testing your hay. And if you can't test your hay, you need to be soaking it before you're feeding it, whether it's orchard, Broom, Timothy, or teff, right? To be safe, you just don't know. So I think those are really important things to remember. And some bales are not always learn what makes good hay, right? It should smell sweet. It should be a good color. Shouldn't have too much trash in it, although occasionally there's going to be trash in your hay because somebody drove down the road and threw a Coke can over the fence and it got caught up in the baler and got baled into your hay. So look at your hay before you feed it. Accept the fact that there's probably going to be some weeds in your hay every now and again, but learn what weeds are potentially hazardous and what aren't. And keep in mind that horses that are well-fed generally avoid plants they shouldn't eat. So as long as you're feeding your horses well, if there's an occasional bit of weed in there, it's probably not the end of the world. But yeah, if you're getting bale after bale after bale with a lot of weed in it, you need to go back to your hay grower and have that conversation and see maybe if you can trade those bales out for something else. But yeah, it feels really good when your hay barn is full. I remember that growing up, we used to get our hay in for the whole winter. And there's nothing quite like knowing that you're ready for winter because your hay barn is full.
For our listeners, if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send your suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at ClarityEquine.com.
And if you've enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd share it with your friends on social media and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.